The river tells you everything. His grandfather used to say, "You just have to be patient enough to let it finish the sentence." Walter Inoue had heard that line in two languages his whole life. First in the careful, accented English his grandfather had taught himself reading Union pamphlets in the 1930s, and underneath it, always, the cadence of the Japanese his grandfather never fully let go of.
These records
Even
from the
60 years
1970s
after
show the
coming to
river's
Columbia
health has
River with
declined.
nothing
This
but a
notebook
willingness to
details the
learn
fish
water that
populations we
wasn't
need to
his.
consider.
Walter was 68 years old. He had been listening to that river his entire life. His grandfather had crossed the Pacific in 1923 at 19, with almost nothing, and found his way to the lower Columbia because someone in a labor camp had told him there was work on the river for a man willing to learn it. He had learned it. He had married, raised a son, built a small fishing operation out of patience and repetition, and somewhere in that long process of learning a river that wasn't his by birth, he had decided it was worth writing down what he saw. He fished the same lower river stretch his grandfather had worked after arriving in 1923, setting gill nets in the same channels, reading the same seasonal rhythms that 3 generations of Inoues had learned to recognize the way you recognize a relative's handwriting. His grandfather had started keeping notes almost as soon as he learned enough English to write them. Dates, run sizes, water conditions, scrawled in a mixture of English words and Japanese characters that Walter's own father had only partially been able to translate, and that Walter himself understood mostly through years of cross-referencing, asking elderly relatives, and simple repetition. 3 generations of pages. The earliest in his grandfather's careful bilingual hand, brittle now, kept in a cedar box that had survived more than the records themselves had survived. His father's continuation, mostly English by then, spanning 4 decades of a life that included 2 years in an internment camp during a war that didn't ask whether a family had spent 20 years learning to read a specific river, that simply took the family from the water for 2 years and gave it back afterward as if nothing had happened, though everyone involved understood that something had. And Walter's own records, kept since he was old enough to fish alongside his father, now numbering well past 60 volumes. The handwriting changing slightly as he aged, but the categories never changing at all. The fall Chinook run was the centerpiece of those records. Every year, the same basic pattern. Fish arriving from the ocean in a single continuous push, building to a peak, then tapering off, predictable enough in its broad strokes that you could plan a season around it even while the details shifted year to year. For 60 years, in every notebook, in every generation's hand, it had always been one run, one push, one story. 5 years ago, it became 2. Walter noticed it the way he noticed most things on the water, not all at once, but as a nagging discrepancy between what he expected and what he was seeing. The run started normally enough that first year, fish arriving on schedule, numbers building the way they always did. Then, roughly 3 weeks in, the numbers dropped, not gradually, sharply, almost like someone had closed a valve. For nearly 2 weeks, Walter's nets came up nearly empty during what should have been the heart of the run. Then the fish came back, a second pulse, smaller than the first, arriving weeks later than any Chinook run he'd ever recorded or heard described in family history. He wrote it down with a question mark. The following year, it happened again, same pattern, same gap, same delayed secondary push. By the 3rd year, Walter had stopped marking it as unusual and started marking it as a pattern. The way you stop questioning a strange noise in your house once it becomes the new normal sound the house makes. He talked about it with his son once. Over coffee, the two of them sitting on the dock the way Walter used to sit with his own father. His son fished part-time now, between a job in town and weekends on the water, the family's relationship with the river thinning the way it thinned in most families eventually. His son hadn't noticed a split. He hadn't been on the water often enough, across enough seasons, to have built the baseline that made the change visible. He pulled every notebook he could read clearly, his own, his father's, the portions of his grandfather's he'd managed to translate over the years, and found nothing like it. 60 years of one continuous run, interrupted now, for 5 consecutive seasons, by an inexplicable gap in the middle. He didn't know what was causing it. He started looking for what had changed. The thing that had changed, as far as Walter could tell, was upstream, at the hydroelectric dam that controlled flow on the stretch of the river, a facility that had been there his entire life, but had recently begun operating under a new release schedule. The utility that operated the dam had shifted over the past several years toward what they called demand-responsive releases, adjusting water flow not on a fixed daily schedule, but dynamically in response to regional power demand. More water released during peak electricity hours, when turbines needed maximum flow to generate maximum power, less during off-peak periods. It made sense from a power generation standpoint. Walter understood that much without needing an engineering degree. What he didn't understand, not yet, was whether it had anything to do with the fish. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't know how a hydroelectric facility decided when to open its gates, what triggered the difference between a steady release and a pulsing one, or whether fish even noticed the kind of flow variation that registered on a power company's demand curve. He only knew that two things had started happening around the same time, and that his family's 60 years of records said the timing wasn't a coincidence he was comfortable ignoring. He started paying closer attention to the timing, not just of the run, but the dam's release pattern, which he could partially observe just from the river's flow and level changes at his own fishing grounds, miles downstream. He began noting flow fluctuations in his logbook alongside his catch records, a habit he hadn't kept before because it had never seemed relevant. The gap in the run, each of those 5 years, fell during a stretch when the dam's releases had become noticeably more irregular, pulsing up and down across each day rather than holding steady, chasing the rhythm of regional electricity demand rather than the steadier pattern the dam had run for decades before. He didn't know if that meant anything. He kept watching. The opportunity to say something formally came the following spring, when the utility proposed further modifications to the release schedule, changes that would make the demand-driven pulses even more pronounced, optimizing further for peak-hour power generation. A public comment session was scheduled at the regional fisheries office. Walter brought 5 years of catch data showing the split run pattern, cross-referenced loosely against the flow irregularities he'd been able to observe from downstream. He brought, too, the oldest notebook he could safely transport, his grandfather's earliest volume, more as testimony than evidence, a way of showing the room that his family had been watching this river since before the dam existed in its current form. The utilities fisheries biologist, a careful man named Dr. Halverson, listened to full presentation without interrupting. When Walter finished, Halverson acknowledged that the run-splitting pattern was an interesting observation, but pointed out that chinook run timing naturally varied from year to year due to a wide range of factors: ocean conditions, river temperature, individual fish behavior. And that 5 years, however consistent, wasn't a long enough baseline to establish statistical significance against the kind of natural variability fisheries science expected. "We track run timing closely," Halverson said. "If there were a systemic problem, we'd expect to see it reflected across multiple monitoring stations, not just at one fishing location." Walter understood the logic. He also understood that the monitoring stations Halverson was describing counted fish, not flow patterns, and that none of them sat at the specific reach of river, where Walter's family had spent 100 years learning to read the difference between a run that was simply smaller and a run that had been interrupted mid-arrival. Walter asked whether anyone had cross-referenced the dam's actual release telemetry, the precise minute-by-minute record of when and how much water was released, against the run timing data for those same 5 years. Halverson said the utilities release records and the state's fish passage data were maintained by different agencies, and, to his knowledge, hadn't been formally cross-referenced for this kind of pattern analysis. Walter said, maybe someone should. Halverson said he'd note the suggestion. The schedule modification was approved 3 months later. For the first year after the new schedule went into effect, Walter watched the run split the same way it had for the previous 5 years. Early pulse, gap, smaller secondary pulse. Nothing dramatically worse. Nothing that confirmed anything beyond what he already suspected. He told himself maybe he was wrong about the cause. Halverson's point about natural variability wasn't unreasonable. Walter had been fishing this river long enough to know that not every pattern had a single clean explanation, that sometimes the water did things for reasons that simply weren't available to a man standing on a boat deck with a logbook, however many generations of logbooks stood behind him. He'd misread the river before. Years ago, he'd been certain an early spring chinook surge meant a strong overall season, only to watch the numbers collapse weeks later for reasons that turned out to have nothing to do with anything he could have observed from the water. He kept fishing. He kept recording. He waited to see what the second year under the new schedule would show. The second year, the secondary pulse arrived even later than before, nearly 3 weeks behind the gap, pushed into a stretch of river running noticeably warmer than the earlier portion of the run had experienced. Walter started noticing dead and dying fish among his catch in numbers he hadn't seen before. Chinook that clearly made it most of the way upstream before succumbing to something. Exhaustion, disease, the cumulative stress of warm water on a fish whose biology wasn't built for late-season heat. He reported the mortality to the State Fish and Wildlife Office. They logged it as part of a broader pattern they were tracking that year. Elevated pre-spawning mortality across several Columbia tributaries, attributed in their preliminary assessment to a documented marine heat wave that had affected ocean conditions the previous year, reducing fish condition before they even entered the river. The biologist who took his report was sympathetic and thorough, and the explanation she offered fit cleanly with what regional fisheries managers were already seeing elsewhere on the system that season. It was a real explanation. Walter had read about the heat wave in the fishing press himself. It made sense as a contributing factor. But something about it didn't sit right with him, and it took him most of that winter to articulate what. He went back through his 5 years of split-run data and laid it out against everything he could find about regional ocean conditions for those same years. The heat wave the state was citing had only affected one of the 5 years he documented the run-splitting pattern. The pattern itself, the gap, the delayed secondary pulse, had been consistent across all 5 seasons, heat wave or no heat wave. If ocean conditions were driving the split, the pattern should have varied with ocean conditions. It hadn't. It had varied, as far as Walter could tell, with the dam's release schedule. He called a fisheries researcher he'd met years earlier at a tribal fishing rights meeting, a careful woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who'd since moved into a position doing independent contract research for several Columbia Basin tribes and conservation groups. He described what he'd been seeing: the split run, the correlation with release timing rather than ocean conditions, the rise in mortality in the secondary pulse. She asked if she could see his data. He sent her copies of 5 years of logbook entries, photograph pages, his handwriting, dates and numbers, and brief notations about water conditions that probably meant more to him than they would to anyone reading them cold. He didn't hear from her for 2 weeks and started to assume the data hadn't been useful, that a fisherman's notebook wasn't the kind of evidence a researcher could actually build something on. Then she called back. She had done what nobody at the utility or the state had apparently thought to do. She had requested the dam's actual minute-by-minute release telemetry for the past 5 years, cross-referenced it directly against daily fish passage counts of the dam itself, which the utility was required to monitor, but had never formally compared against downstream catch data the way Walter's logbooks allowed. The correlation, when she laid it out, was almost exact. She had built a simple overlay chart, release telemetry on one axis, fish passage count on the other, 5 years stacked one above the next, and the pattern jumped out the moment you saw it laid out visually rather than buried in separate spreadsheets maintained by separate agencies that had never thought to compare notes. Every year the run split. The gap corresponded precisely to a period of unusually irregular release pulsing, water volume swinging sharply up and down within each day, chasing peak electricity demand rather than holding to any steady pattern. The biological mechanism, she explained to Walter in terms he could follow, wasn't mysterious once you knew what to look for. A portion of each year's Chinook run relied on consistent flow cues during a critical developmental window to trigger their final upstream push. When the flow became erratic during that exact window, that portion of the run effectively paused, holding the lower river or estuary until conditions stabilized enough to resume migration, arriving weeks later than they would have under steadier flow, and arriving into progressively warmer water as the season advanced. This isn't subtle. Once you see it laid out properly, she told him. I don't know why nobody connected it before. Walter said, nobody put the two records next to each other. The utility had one. The fish had the other. Nobody official was the one walking the boat deck every morning, watching both happen at the same time. Before they took the finding to the state, Walter remembered something. He went back to his grandfather's earliest surviving notebook, the one he could only partially translate, and found his father's annotation in the margin of an entry from the early 1950s, a brief note explaining, in English, what his grandfather's Japanese characters described: an early experimental hydropower configuration being tested at the dam during its initial calibration period. Before the facility settled into the steadier operational pattern it had run for the following 6 decades. His grandfather's entry, translated through his father's annotation, described a single season in which the Chinook run had split into 2 pulses, one early, one delayed, coinciding precisely with that testing period. The notebook noted the secondary pulse's losses to warm water before the entry simply moved on to the following season. The testing period apparently concluded, and the dam settling into its normal pattern, the split run never recurring again until now. Walter sat with that entry for a long time. His grandfather had seen this exact thing happen once before, 70 years earlier, during an earlier era of dam experimentation. He had written it down, in a language his own son could barely read, describing a pattern nobody had thought to look for again until the dam started doing the same thing the new schedule was now asking it to do. Dr. Anand's formal report went to the State Department of Fish and Wildlife and, separately, to the federal agency overseeing Endangered Species Act compliance for the river system, given the mortality trend's implications for broader run's long-term viability. The report included the telemetry correlation as its primary evidence, but also included, as an appendix, a translated excerpt from Walter's grandfather's 1953 notebook entry, the only known historical precedent for the exact pattern now threatening the run. The utility did not contest the findings once the telemetry correlation was laid out clearly. What followed was a negotiation lasting the better part of a year over how to modify the release schedule to preserve some of the demand-responsive flexibility the utility needed while restoring enough flow consistency during the critical migration window to prevent the run from splitting. The final agreement wasn't a complete reversal. It allowed the utility to maintain variable releases during most of the season, but mandated a steady, predictable flow pattern during a specific 6-week window each fall. The exact window, cross-referenced against 3 generations of Inoue family records, when a run had always needed consistency before, and apparently still did. The first season under the revised schedule, the run held together. One push. The way it had for 60 years before the schedule changes began, the way it had been described in every notebook going back to 1923, except for the brief 1953 testing period, and the 5 recent years that had echoed it. Walter fished that fall the way he'd fished every fall of his life, setting nets in the same channels his grandfather had learned, watching the Chinook arrive in their old familiar rhythm. He recorded it the way he always had, dates, numbers, water conditions, and added one more note that he didn't usually include. He wrote, partly for the eventual benefit of whoever read these pages after him, "Run held together this year. One push, like the old records show." Like grandfather's notes from before the testing, before 1953, the water remembers what it's supposed to do, if you let it. He thought about his grandfather, crossing an ocean at 19 to build a life on a river he didn't yet know, in a language he was still learning, leaving behind notebooks that mixed 2 alphabets because he was documenting something for which neither language alone was sufficient, the careful brushwork of characters his own son could only partially read, sitting beside English words borrowed from a country that hadn't always wanted him there. He thought about his father, translating what he could during the rare moments such translation felt necessary, never imagining a researcher decades later would need it to explain a federal compliance finding, never imagining that the margin notes he'd made almost as an afterthought would someday matter more than anything else in the file. Walter closed the current notebook and set it on the shelf beside his father's volumes, which sat beside his grandfather's cedar box, 3 generations of the same patient attention to the same stretch of water, finally, after a long detour, telling the same story again.